What would you risk to protect someone you love? Your freedom. Your future. Maybe even your own good name. Sometimes, the hardest battles we fight are the ones no one else sees, the quiet wars inside our hearts, when loyalty demands more than words. This is one of those stories. It was a Thursday afternoon when Daniel Reid stood in front of the checkout counter, holding nothing but a few simple items: milk, bread, a can of soup. The line behind him was short, the air heavy with the slow hum of fluorescent lights. He placed the items on the counter and reached for his wallet, patting the pockets of his worn jacket. But before he could say a word, the store manager approached with 2 uniformed officers by his side. Whispers rippled through the small store as Daniel was asked, without fanfare, without kindness, to step aside. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply nodded once, placed his hands calmly behind his back, and allowed the cold click of handcuffs to close around his wrists. No one cheered. No one protested. They only watched, their eyes filled with the quiet judgment that falls so easily on a man who doesn't fight back. Outside, the sky was a dull, leaden gray, mirroring the heaviness that seemed to settle over Daniel's shoulders as he was led to the waiting police car. Not a single word passed his lips. No excuses. No explanations. Because sometimes, the truth is heavier than handcuffs. And sometimes, a man chooses silence, even when it costs him everything. Daniel Reid sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders squared but his head bowed slightly, as if the very weight of the room pressed against him. The courtroom wasn't grand. It was small, almost tired, with faded wood panels and scuffed floors that had seen too many stories like his. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a slow, deliberate manner, adjusted her glasses and called the court to order. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't scan the room looking for sympathy. He kept his gaze lowered, hands folded neatly on the table in front of him, as if bracing for a storm he had already accepted. The prosecutor, a tall man with neatly combed hair and a crisp suit, rose from his chair and began to speak. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Mr. Reid was apprehended in possession of stolen goods. He offered no explanation at the time of arrest, nor has he provided one since. We believe this is a straightforward case of petty theft. The words were clinical, almost bored. To the prosecutor, Daniel was a file number, a case to close before lunch. Daniel didn't react. He didn't glance at the jury, didn't shift in his seat. He sat like a stone in a river, letting the current rush around him without resistance. His defense attorney, a younger man named Alex Monroe, stood up slowly, hesitating just long enough to reveal his own unease. Your Honor, Mr. Reid has the right to remain silent. But I must state for the record, there is corroborating evidence that could fully explain Mr. Reid's innocence. He turned to Daniel then, not with frustration, but with a silent plea. Mr. Reid, he said gently, will you allow me to present that evidence today? Daniel lifted his head for the first time since entering the courtroom. His eyes, a pale, weathered blue, met Monroe's. There was no anger there, no fear. Just a kind of quiet sadness, a decision already made. He shook his head once, a small but firm motion. The judge observed the exchange without comment. Monroe hesitated, pressing his lips together. Then he turned back to the bench. No further statements at this time, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the sparse audience. People shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that said more than words. A man refusing to defend himself, it made no sense. It challenged the very nature of how the system was supposed to work. Daniel sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly, almost imperceptibly. He wasn't a man fighting for his name. He wasn't begging for mercy. He was enduring. Outside the tall windows, a cold winter sun hung low in the sky. The light slanted across Daniel's face, tracing the fine lines etched deep into his skin, the kind of lines carved by years, not just by this single moment. The judge cleared her throat, her voice steady. We will proceed to hear witness testimonies. Daniel didn't move. He knew what was coming. And he had already made peace with what he would lose to protect what mattered most. In a room full of voices, his silence was the loudest sound of all. The first witness was called. A young cashier, no more than 20, stood nervously at the front of the courtroom. She spoke about how she saw Daniel in the store, how she thought he looked suspicious. She admitted she hadn't seen him take anything but said she felt like something wasn't right. The prosecutor nodded along, satisfied. It was enough to plant the seed of doubt. Enough to let assumptions do the work that evidence could not. Daniel sat still, his face unreadable. His attorney, Monroe, scribbled a note on a yellow legal pad and slid it across the table to him. It read simply, "We can still call your alibi witness. Just say the word." Daniel stared at the note for a long moment. He could almost feel the weight of it in his hand. He could clear his name with a few short sentences. A name, a time, a place, that's all it would take. Monroe leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel, you don't have to carry this alone." Daniel looked up at him. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his features, not fear, not anger, but a tired kind of sorrow. He shook his head once, slow and deliberate. "Not here. Not now." Monroe sat back, his shoulders sagging slightly. He understood, even if he didn't agree. The judge called for the next witness. Mark Ellis. A rustle went through the courtroom as Mark rose from the back. He was a man in his late 30s, wearing a cheap dress shirt that didn't quite hide the worry stitched across his face. He took the stand, his hands fidgeting in his lap as he was sworn in. The prosecutor led him through the basic questions. Mark answered them all carefully, eyes darting once or twice toward Daniel but never meeting his gaze for long. He said he didn't see Daniel steal anything. He said he couldn't remember if Daniel had paid or not. He said a lot of things that weren't outright lies, but weren't the full truth either. Daniel watched him in silence, his expression calm but his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He wasn't angry. He wasn't betrayed. This was exactly what he had chosen to protect. The courtroom grew colder with each answer Mark gave. The kind of cold that comes not from the weather, but from something slipping away, trust, maybe, or decency. The prosecutor wrapped up quickly, satisfied that Mark's vague testimony wouldn't help Daniel. Monroe had the right to cross-examine, but he didn't. He looked at Daniel one last time for permission, a silent question hanging in the air. Daniel lowered his gaze, giving nothing away. Monroe stood down. The silence between them said everything. Sometimes loyalty means standing alone. Sometimes it means carrying the weight so that someone else doesn't have to. And Daniel Reid was a man who had made his choice long before he ever walked into that courtroom. The room grew colder as the minutes dragged on. It wasn't the temperature, it was the feeling. A slow, creeping chill that settled into the walls, into the bones of everyone sitting there. Daniel Reid sat perfectly still, his hands folded again on the defendant's table, his face quiet and unreadable. Around him, the murmurs faded, the scraping of chairs slowed. Even the bailiff by the door shifted his weight less often, as if the air itself had thickened. The judge peered down from her bench, adjusting her glasses with a small, deliberate movement. She looked at Daniel for a long moment, as if weighing something heavier than the simple facts of the case. Then she scribbled a few notes, her pen scratching against paper in the heavy silence. Monroe sat beside Daniel, leafing through papers he no longer believed would make a difference. He glanced sideways, studying Daniel's posture, his steady breathing, the way he anchored himself to that chair as if it were the last piece of solid ground in a rising tide. "Are you sure about this?" Monroe whispered, barely audible. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. His stillness was his answer. A clock ticked from somewhere behind the bench. Each second snapped like a distant drumbeat, marking the slow passage of time Daniel had no intention of rushing. On the other side of the room, jurors sat uneasy. A woman in a gray cardigan twisted her wedding ring over and over. An older man with a thick mustache scribbled a few words in the margins of his notepad and then crossed them out again. They all watched Daniel, but none of them could quite meet his gaze when he lifted his head. Because there was something unsettling about a man who refused to defend himself. Something almost unnatural about someone choosing silence over freedom. The prosecutor shuffled his papers, his earlier confidence thinning. Without a confession, without a clear rebuttal, he had to lean on assumptions and suspicions. And that made him restless. The judge tapped her pen once, sharply, against the desk. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice even but cool, "do you wish to call any further witnesses?" Monroe cleared his throat, hesitating just enough for the room to notice. "No, Your Honor," he said, voice low. "Not at this time." The judge nodded and leaned back slightly in her chair. "Very well," she said. "The court will proceed." Daniel exhaled softly through his nose, a breath almost lost in the quiet around him. He could feel the judgment pressing in, thicker now, heavier. It wasn't the judgment of guilt or innocence. It was the judgment of a world that didn't understand why a man would stay silent. He thought of all the battles he had fought before, some in uniform, some in hospital waiting rooms, some in the dead of night when no one was there to see him wrestle with the weight of doing the right thing. This battle was no different. It was just lonelier. The courtroom, once bustling with energy, now felt hollow. As if all the hope, all the certainty, had slowly drained out of it. And Daniel sat there, the still point in a room full of shifting shadows, waiting for the next moment to come, whatever it would cost him. At the back of the courtroom, Mark Ellis sat frozen. His hands clenched tightly in his lap, the muscles in his jaw working against words he couldn't bring himself to say. The judge's voice moved distantly through the air, calling for closing remarks, setting the machinery of the trial back into motion. But to Mark, it all sounded muffled, like he was underwater, trapped beneath the surface of a choice he didn't know how to make. He felt the sweat bead at his temples, cold and unwelcome. He wiped his hands against the fabric of his pants, but it did nothing to steady the trembling. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat louder than the last. He looked up. Daniel sat at the front of the room, motionless. Not defeated. Not angry. Just steady. Mark swallowed hard. He thought about his wife, Sarah, home right now with their youngest child still too sick to walk on her own. He thought about the job he desperately needed, the health insurance they couldn't afford to lose. He thought about how one word, just one, could topple everything he was barely holding together. But then he thought about Daniel. The man who once, years ago, had pulled him out from under enemy fire overseas. The man who now sat accused of a crime Mark knew he hadn't committed, a crime Mark had let happen. Guilt clawed at Mark's throat. He shifted in his seat, his shoes scuffing softly against the floor. Someone nearby glanced at him, then quickly looked away. He bent forward, resting his elbows on his knees, covering his face with his hands for a moment. Maybe no one would ever know. Maybe Daniel would walk away with a slap on the wrist. Maybe. But deep down, Mark knew better. Daniel had made his choice. And now, the choice was Mark's. He straightened up slowly, hands trembling slightly in his lap. His chest rose and fell with a shaky breath. He looked at Daniel again, willing him to glance back, to give him a sign, something that would make this easier. But Daniel didn't look back. He kept his eyes ahead, steady as ever, carrying the burden alone without asking for help. Mark's throat tightened painfully. He thought he could live with the shame. He thought he could push it down, bury it under excuses and needs and responsibilities. But sitting here, seeing the quiet dignity in Daniel's silence, Mark realized something simple and terrible. He wasn't just letting Daniel down. He was losing himself. The judge's gavel tapped once, snapping the courtroom back to life. The prosecutor stood, adjusting his jacket, preparing to deliver the final summary. Mark's heart pounded so loudly now that he barely heard it when he pushed himself up from his chair. The legs of his seat scraped back with a harsh, unmistakable sound. Heads turned. The judge paused, frowning slightly. The prosecutor hesitated mid-step. Mark's voice cracked the stillness. "Your Honor," he said, the words trembling out of him, raw and desperate. "I need to speak." Daniel, still seated at the defendant's table, finally turned his head just slightly. No anger. No fear. Just a quiet understanding that passed between them in the space of a heartbeat. Mark stepped forward, his hands open, his face bare. He was trembling, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Because sometimes saving yourself meant standing up. Sometimes saving a friend meant not letting him carry your shame for you. And sometimes, doing the right thing hurt just as much as doing the wrong one. Mark Ellis stood at the center of the courtroom, the weight of every eye pressing down on him. His chest tightened under the pressure, but he didn't move away. He couldn't. Not anymore. The judge leaned forward slightly, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. "You may speak, Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice even but firm. Mark cleared his throat, but his voice when it came was raw, stripped of all pretense. "I lied," he said, the words falling into the silent room like stones into a still pond. "I know Daniel Reid didn't steal anything." A murmur rippled across the courtroom, quick and sharp, but the judge lifted a hand for silence. "Explain yourself," she said, her tone harder now, testing the weight of his confession. Mark's hands shook slightly as he gripped the wooden railing in front of him. "I saw him that day," he said. "I saw him pay. I didn't say anything because..." He stopped, swallowing the bitter taste in his mouth. "My job," he whispered, almost too quietly to hear. "My family. I thought if I said nothing, it would be easier. That it wouldn't matter." His eyes found Daniel's across the room. Daniel sat there, quiet, the same way he had sat through every minute of this trial. But there was something new now, something almost imperceptible, a faint lifting of his chin, the smallest softening in his eyes. Mark took a shaky breath and turned back to the judge. "It mattered," he said. "It matters." The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room. "Your Honor, this man's testimony..." The judge cut him off with a sharp glance. "Mr. Ellis, are you willing to make this statement under oath?" Mark nodded. "I am," he said, firmer now. The bailiff brought him forward, swearing him in again. Mark's voice was steady this time as he repeated the truth, not just about Daniel, but about his own failure, his own cowardice. When he finished, the room stayed silent for a long moment. No one moved. The judge folded her hands neatly atop her desk, her gaze heavy but not unkind. She turned her attention to the prosecutor, who now looked less certain than he had all morning. "Given this new testimony," the judge said, "the court will take a short recess to review the case." She rapped the gavel once, and the courtroom stirred back to life, the buzz of whispered conversations filling the cold air. Mark didn't move. He didn't go back to his seat. He just stood there, shoulders squared, facing the cost of what he had done, and what he had finally tried to set right. Daniel rose slowly from his chair, smoothing the front of his jacket. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. But as he passed by Mark, he paused for just a second. A small nod. Nothing more. But it was enough. Because in that quiet gesture, Mark heard all the words Daniel didn't say. Forgiveness. Understanding. And something even harder to earn, respect. The courtroom doors swung open to let in the afternoon light, and for the first time since the day had begun, it felt just a little less heavy. The courtroom settled into a heavy quiet as the judge returned to her bench. She placed a single sheet of paper in front of her, smoothed it once with the flat of her hand, and looked out across the room. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. "In light of new sworn testimony, and the lack of credible evidence supporting the charges, this court finds the defendant, Daniel Reid, not guilty." The gavel came down with a soft, final knock. No one cheered. There were no loud exclamations, no embraces, no dramatic music swelling to mark the moment. There was just the faint shuffle of papers being gathered, the quiet scrape of chairs being pushed back, and the muted sighs of a system grinding slowly forward. Daniel rose from his seat. He didn't look surprised. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once to the judge, a small, respectful dip of his head, a soldier's acknowledgement of a duty seen through to its bitter end. Mark Ellis stood off to the side, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He didn't expect forgiveness. And Daniel didn't offer it, not with words. He offered something smaller, quieter, but somehow even heavier, a glance, brief and steady, that said plainly, "You did what you needed to do." It was not absolution. It was understanding. And sometimes, that was the harder gift. The prosecutor gathered his files without looking at anyone. He moved quickly, the brisk efficiency of a man eager to be somewhere else, anywhere else. The judge rose from the bench and disappeared through a door behind her. The bailiff opened the side exit with a quiet nod toward Daniel, granting him the dignity of leaving without being paraded through the main aisle like a spectacle. Daniel adjusted the worn jacket draped over his shoulders and walked forward. His steps were slow but sure, like a man who had marched through heavier fields than this. As he reached the doorway, he paused. Just for a moment. Without turning, without raising his hand high, he brought his fingers to his temple in a small, almost imperceptible salute. Not to the judge. Not to the courtroom. To the unseen brothers he carried with him. To the codes he refused to betray. To the silent promises that had shaped his life more than any law could. Most people didn't notice. They gathered their coats, their notes, their quiet judgments, and moved on to the next case, the next day. But Mark saw it. And Monroe saw it. And maybe, in the long slow heart of the building itself, something unseen bowed back. Daniel lowered his hand, pulled the door open, and stepped into the pale afternoon light. There were no reporters waiting outside. No family members rushing to greet him. No celebration. Just the gray stretch of sidewalk, the chill of a late winter breeze, and the long road ahead. And Daniel Reid, carrying nothing but his silence, walked down that road without looking back. Daniel walked down the steps of the courthouse, his boots hitting the concrete with the steady rhythm of a man used to carrying more than most people ever would. The streets around him buzzed with life, cars honking, people rushing past with bags and phones and worries of their own. No one stopped. No one even noticed him. And maybe that was exactly the way he wanted it. He paused at the corner, waiting for the light to change. The cold wind tugged at the edges of his jacket, but he made no move to pull it tighter. He stood there, letting the world move around him, a fixed point in a current that never slowed down. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9, bumped into him accidentally while chasing a loose soccer ball. Daniel caught the ball with a single hand, steady and sure, and handed it back with a small nod. The boy grinned shyly and ran off without a word. Daniel watched him disappear into the crowd. For a moment, he allowed himself a quiet smile. Small moments. That's what life was made of now. Not headlines. Not grand speeches. Small, almost invisible moments where a man could still choose dignity, even when no one was looking. The light turned green. Daniel crossed the street, his shadow stretching long ahead of him under the afternoon sun. He didn't think about the trial anymore. He didn't think about Mark, or Monroe, or the people who had stared at him with doubt in their eyes. He thought about the promises he had made long ago, promises that didn't fade just because life grew hard. Loyalty wasn't something you put down when it became inconvenient. It wasn't something you traded for comfort or recognition. It was the weight you chose to carry, even when no one else could see it. Even when it left you standing alone at a crosswalk on a cold afternoon, with nothing in your pockets but your name and your word. Daniel kept walking. Not fast. Not slow. Just steady. Somewhere far behind him, the courthouse doors closed with a soft, echoing thud. But the sound didn't follow him. He carried his own silence now. And in that silence, there was more honor than most men ever found in all the noise in the world. Because loyalty, real loyalty, never dies. It only walks forward. Step by quiet step. In a world that moves fast and often forgets the quiet sacrifices made in its shadow, Daniel Reid's story reminds us that true loyalty isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention or reward. It stands firm in silence, even when misunderstood, even when it costs everything. Daniel never needed a courtroom to declare his worth. He didn't need a headline to validate his choice. His loyalty lived in the quiet decisions, the ones no one else saw, the ones that defined his character long before anyone tried to judge it. It's easy to speak up when it benefits us. It's harder to stay silent when speaking out could save us, but hurt someone we care about. Daniel chose the harder path. He carried the burden not because it made him a hero in the eyes of others, but because he knew, deep down, who he was and what he stood for. In the end, loyalty isn't about grand gestures. It's about the quiet steps we take when no one is watching. It's about the promises we keep, even when the world has moved on. And maybe, just maybe, it's those unseen acts of courage that shape the world more than any speech or banner ever could. If Daniel's story touched your heart the way it touched ours, we invite you to reflect. When was the last time you stood firm for someone, even when it cost you something real? If you believe that quiet heroes like Daniel deserve to be remembered, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs this reminder today, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Together, let's keep these powerful, unseen acts of courage alive, one story at a time.